Hey, Grandmasters, Mike Amori, 4 o'clock update, second week. Welcome, one and all. We looked at a very interesting line that can be played with black and with white, actually, that I don't recommend that you use full time unless it's been shown to you. I know that Ben in the class uses this as his main weapon against e4, but just to go out and play it, I wouldn't recommend it because you need to get some tactics in. You want to keep the queens on the board. Although, you know, a kid like Ben who likes these positions, this is perfectly fine to play. So what did we look at? Okay, we looked at the normal perk defense move order and an early e5 by black, which allows white to trade the queens. Now, if you continue playing in this position with standard developing moves with white, you can get a very dry equal position quickly. And that's what happened in this game. However, don't forget that just because the computer says the position is equal, if the player with the black pieces understands the structure, there's a very, very good chance of them finding something either interesting or tactical because they're comfortable playing inside the structure. And I use the word inside because think about it. Your pieces have to live inside this pawn structure. So in the actual game, white played the standard knight f3. And in this position, it's not the world's greatest move because black can defend it in a way they normally wouldn't. They can use their f-pawn. And there are situations where the f-pawn is pushed early, even with the queens on. But in this position, it's actually a very useful move because it creates for black, let me put this chain on the board, this really solid pawn chain that, in a sense, shuts out this knight and the dark squared bishop from doing anything bad to us on this side of the board. Trust me, black is not winning by any means. I mean, black is probably slightly worse here. But, again, if you learn structure, you're able to play these positions out and be comfortable. After knight c3, if you remember, the move pawn c6 was played. So this looks like really wacky for black. You trade queens on move 3, you're pushing nothing but pawns, and your king is stuck on d8 not being able to castle. But again, black has to play inside this pawn structure, and it turns out, because the queens are off the board, this is perfectly fine here. Keep in mind that the only way to get to the black king would be on this file or on one of these diagonals, but you can see that that's really not going to happen anytime soon. So white continued developing with bishop c4, and this all looks good. And then we talked about this very bizarre, strange-looking knight d7. And this is a positional concept. Knight d7 is played here. Even though it's blocking in the light squared bishop, the knight is played to secure this square, the c5 square. And the reason we want that square secured is that we want this bishop to come here and be able to trade itself off for white's dark squared bishop. Because technically, since we have these pawns on dark squares, including the middle pawn, they say that this is our bad bishop, and that white has a pawn stuck in the middle of the board. They'll say this is their bad bishop. And again, we discussed in class, hey, you know, this is really hard to call a bad bishop. It's got a beautiful diagonal, but I think you guys got the point. Anyway, white castled in this position. And it's like, man, I'm not so sure that castling would have been the best call here. I was very happy, by the way, after this move, after the queens came off, that Andrew F., I won't use his last name here, immediately said that, hey, I'm going for f4, and I'm going to blow open the board and mate the black king. You see, back here in my game, white not only can't play f4, when he castled, he's pretty much giving me a free move. Or at least he's giving Grandmaster Lombardi a free move. I really had nothing to do with this. I was just the one pushing the pieces. So the king comes off the file and comes to c7, and it's really a waiting move. We want to see if white is going to continue developing his last minor piece. Sometimes players will play rook to d1 here, which is sort of setting a trap. If I waste a move, I just want to show you something like, let's say knight h6, and then white plays this move. I would have to be really careful here, because if I attempt to trade off the dark square bishops, I could run into trouble with rook takes knight, an in-between move, and black is going to lose the 2 minor pieces for the rook, and this is really, really good for white. You see these 2 bishops, kind of nasty. So a good waiting move back in this position here might be rook to d1. It's not really a waiting move at all. It's actually a very strong move. You just take the file and you prevent black from playing this move right away. But in the game, white just trotted the bishop out to e3, and that gives us an opportunity to offer this trade of dark squared bishops. Being behind in development as we are, I'll just take you back, we really only have half a piece in the game. I would say that our kings are equally castled. I mean, I think I can get away with saying that. But white does have 4 minor pieces out, and we kind of have a half a piece out, just half a knight. I wonder where the other half is. Anyway, we play bishop c5, and if white keeps playing these moves, these standard moves, they can end up in a little bit of trouble, or at least in unfamiliar territory. So we take back, and then the knight gets hit with b4. And this idea has come up so many times. Like, I've played 400,000 blitz games from this position, or one like it. And I know that when b4 is played, not to retreat the knight, that it's a better idea, and again, this just comes from experience, to challenge white's bishop, because it's hanging, it's out there loose, so why not challenge it, hoping that they'll take our knight, we can take the bishop. So we've given them really a lot of queenside weaknesses here with these pawns, and we have the only bishop. We're going to pick up a tempo, hitting the rook. We develop our knight, challenge the file, and go into an ending with better structure and the only long-range minor piece. We would take our chances with this position. So they're not going to do that. So when you play bishop e6, they're either going to take your bishop, or I remember another grandmaster saying you should always look at these backup moves with the bishop. Even if you give up the bishop for the knight, you do activate a rook in the direction of the black king. So maybe that's a way to spice the game up. I'm not really sure. But in the game, white took right away, and we take back with our knight. Now here, white makes a slight mistake. White in the game played rook a to d1. And the reason I'm saying it's a mistake was black here played the move b5. And by playing b5, it created a second pawn wedge on the board. You guys see that wedge? In the future, black is going to play the move a5 and trying to break. So if you go back here, if you play rook f to d1 and white creates the wedge, or black creates the wedge, do you guys see that you can automatically come here and challenge that wedge and activate your rook? So that's just a little idea. Now you might ask, and again, this is a very hard concept to understand. You might say, well, how do I know that black is going to play this mysterious move b5? You really don't, but it is a question of advancing the pawns on the queen side in the direction of the enemy king. Just because the queens are off the board doesn't mean you can't pawn storm the king. You still can and create some play. But when he plays rook a to d1, now the move b5, you see the pawn wedge I highlighted again, it doesn't really make sense for white to drop back to a1 and battle me on the a file. Okay, instead what he did was rook d2. Everyone in the class immediately understood what that move is about. White wants to double. So we know he's going to double, and we really need to be able to challenge that battery. Knight e7. When the battery is made, we have to challenge, but again, based on the wedge that's here on b4 and b5, we're going to challenge with the h rook. And if he were to trade rooks with us, we would take back with the knight, not allowing the trade. From here, we can maneuver the knight either back to e6, make little maneuvers like this into squares like c4, but we would keep the knight here, get it back in the game, but try to activate our rook. This is an important concept. I want you guys to pay attention to this. Let me put the rook back for a minute. So we had this position after black challenges, right? In the game, white realized he was in an endgame and played king f1. But I want you to pay attention to how quickly black gets rid of one rook. And if you were keeping notebooks at home, this is the time where I would write in your notebook as your coach, 2 rooks that belong on an open file are deadly. A battery on an open file can only be topped by a battery on the 7th rank. If you put 2 rooks on the 7th rank, I'm basically dead. But 2 rooks can be so devastating. You can threaten, you can see here in this position, if I don't challenge you here on this line, you're going to play rook d7 check, winning a piece. So that's why black had to challenge. But the other concept that I want you to understand is after king f1, we immediately trade. Because on the recapture, and by the way, who said you had to take with the rook? Would it have possible to take with the knight? To come here, to come here, to come here, maybe challenge black on some of these weak squares that are in black's camp. But I'm hoping you guys appreciate why it's important not to play like a robot. Just because the rook is on an open file doesn't mean it's effective. There's nothing wrong with going backwards with your knight, blocking a rook if you have a positional or a strategic idea in mind. But white didn't. White took back right away with the rook, and that gives black a chance to continue with a5. And after a5, he supported his pawn. A lot of players like having a pawn on a square like this so that you can keep this knight at a c5. But as soon as he plays it, we just take. He took back, and this is the point that I wanted to make before. If you look at their rook on the line, when you challenge a battery and get rid of one rook, all you have to do pretty much is keep an eye on their penetration squares, which I just highlighted for you. Every square in your territory is protected by either the king or the pawn, and the knight you can see is guarding one as well, or 2. There's no way that that rook's getting in there. It could get in tactically if white had other pieces on the board, but with only 2 knights, it's really hard to sacrifice one of those knights and do something nasty with that rook. So if you can keep that rook out of your territory, you're doing really well. Let's look at the other side here. You see how white has maintained this square by putting a pawn here? But if you look at the penetration squares for our rook, we have one up here on a1, and we also have one here on a3. These 2 are covered by the knight. Okay? Again, another positional idea. You see how well this king is keeping everybody happy. There's no way the rook gets in. Okay. Now, after they take back, so there's the penetration squares again, we're covered. Now what to do? This is the time when knight c8 was played. And even this move, I would say this is move 19. I would say that I found the move over the board, but even the idea had been given to me. I was taught, if I'm playing this kind of structure, give your opponent a rook that can't get in. Give yourself a rook that can get in. But if you're not going to rush in with the rook, then it's time to improve the minor piece. And I had memorized that, so I'll share it with you guys. So here, backing the move up, I have a knight on e7. So how do I improve it? Well, I noticed there's a really nice square here on c8. So that's why I played the move knight c8. I'm sorry, on c4. That's why knight c8 was played, to come into b6 and then into c4. And the game, believe it or not, ends in like 6 moves. g3 was played. That was to prevent knight f4. And then black just continued with the plan, knight to b6. King came to e2. Knight went into c4. And here, I remember this was a game where we had to make 30 moves in 90 minutes. And once we made our 30th move, we would get an extra hour of time. So here in this position, I played the move knight to b2 just to bother the rook, thinking it was going to go back to d2 or something. But instead, for example, if it goes to d2, I could just continue, maybe I can try rook a3. I still have some nice play here, but I may have even repeated the position just to gain some time on the clock. But in the game, my opponent made a mistake. So this was the position. I attacked the rook, and he played rook e3. And some of my students that I work with have things in their notebooks that say rooks don't belong in boxes. And this is one of them. You see that rook over there? That's not a good square for a rook. So knight d4, and white is in trouble. If you take the knight, you're going to get forked. So the king retreated, and now we simply come back and attack the rook, who, don't forget, is responsible for this knight. All right, so that's a problem. Rook went to d3. We simply trade the knights. White gets forked. King g2. Take the rook. Now we're up in exchange. And look at the penetration squares. After rook a3, we're going to be up a rook. Game over. Okay. Okay, let's take a quick look at some of the things that you guys did in your games. Let's take a look at Malcolm and Ben first. Here, I love Malcolm's move. Right away, he's coming right for Ben. He played pawn f4, trying to open the game while the king is kind of hanging out there on d8. Ben defended the pawn with f6. Out comes a knight. Okay, so from this position, we have knight d7 protecting the e5 square. Malcolm played bishop c4, bishop c5 from Ben, knight c3, and here's that pawn move we talked about, which keeps the knight out of d5 and b5. Here, bishop d2 is played, knight e7, Malcolm castles, knight g6. And if you just look at the squares, everything is pretty much covered. Malcolm takes, Ben takes back with the g knight. And this game, believe it or not, is pretty equal here. Ben's king still has a little bit of work to do in terms of securing himself for the middle game, but he has all the major squares under control. Malcolm has an isolated e-pawn, which you don't see as much as the d-pawn, but it is isolated and it's already blockaded. So he's a little behind in development, but Malcolm's bishop up here is blocking the file. This game is pretty level, so I was impressed. Malcolm decides to go in for some more trading. Ben takes with the pawn in order not to allow a discovery. Rook h to f1, taking the file, and here a little bit risky of a move, which I just think loses instantly. Here, after knight b6, Malcolm should probably just throw out bishop e3 check, and this is not so easy here. It's a little bit different than what happened in the game, but I think Malcolm saw bishop d4, so instead he just here retreated his bishop, and now Ben plays bishop g4 attacking the rook. And now when the discovery is played, this is a discovered check, it's not as effective because Ben can take a rook, and when you take back check, you have this move bishop to d4, but here Ben blundered. He actually played king c7, giving Malcolm two minor pieces for a rook, which is something I showed you from my game is not a good idea. You really don't want allow that for white, and after the bishop took, he was in a little bit of trouble. But that's really just a tactical blunder. The positional play prior to the blunder was really good. Okay, let's take a look at one more. I want to show you Misha and Jared. So Misha also went for the f4 plan, Jared defended just like Ben, but here Michael, or Misha, I like Misha, played bishop to c4 as opposed to knight f3, bishop d6, holding the pawns. You know, white a little more space, maybe a little more active. Then the move f5, and these are kind of interesting moves when you take the tension away. But the move b6 was now played, and I had mentioned to Jared after. Now, in all fairness to Jared, he had never played this kind of position before, so his bishop and his pawn structure, you know, really looks a little funny to him. But let me just show you a few more moves. This game, believe it or not, is fairly level. It was decided by a blunder. Bishop to b4, moving the same piece again. Out comes the bishop here, and then bishop takes e4, trying to take advantage of the fact that this knight is pinned, but it ends up costing him the game. Can you guys see what's wrong with the idea? Yeah, he just castled long, and again, after king c8, it just cost him a piece that he was never able to recover. So it just goes to show you that this stuff can, you know, can go either way. Keep up the work, okay? I'm going to post another Accopion video. This one here is just some of your work, and I mostly wanted you to see Lombardi's ideas from that game, and hopefully they sink in, okay? Make sure you solve some puzzles, Grandmasters.